This 1950 wedding picture holds a secret you'll never forget: the inheritance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 2023, delivered by a courier who insisted on checking Eleanor Mitchell's identification twice before handing over the thick manila envelope. Eleanor, a 28-year-old restoration specialist living in Chicago, had been expecting correspondence from the law firm of Hartwell and Associates regarding her great-aunt's estate, but nothing had prepared her for what she found inside. Along with the usual legal documents was a handwritten note from her great-aunt Vivian, whom she had met only once as a child. "Dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have finally passed on, and the secret I have carried for over 70 years can finally be revealed. In this package, you will find a wedding photograph from 1950 that holds the key to understanding our family's most extraordinary legacy. Look carefully at the image, my dear. What you see may seem impossible, but I assure you it is real. The truth has been hidden in plain sight for decades, waiting for someone with your expertise to uncover it. Trust your instincts and remember that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that are true." With love and hope for understanding, your great-aunt Vivian. Eleanor set the letter aside and carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve. It was a large, professionally taken wedding portrait in black and white, showing a bride and groom surrounded by their wedding party on the steps of what appeared to be a grand church. The quality was exceptional for 1950, with sharp detail and careful composition that spoke to the skill of an experienced photographer. The bride was stunning, wearing an elegant satin gown with a sweetheart neckline and a cathedral-length veil. Her dark hair was styled in the fashionable Victory rolls of the era, and she held a bouquet of what appeared to be white roses and baby's breath. The groom, tall and handsome in his military dress uniform, stood proudly beside her with his arm around her waist. The wedding party was arranged in traditional formation, bridesmaids in pale blue dresses on the left, groomsmen in matching military uniforms on the right. Behind them, the Gothic architecture of the church created an impressive backdrop, with ornate stone carvings and tall arched windows visible in the frame. Eleanor studied the photograph with her trained eye, looking for any signs of damage, retouching, or manipulation that might explain her great-aunt's cryptic message. The image appeared to be in excellent condition, with no obvious alterations or anomalies. Yet something about it nagged at her, a subtle wrongness that she couldn't quite identify. She turned her attention to the accompanying documents, which revealed that the photograph had been taken at the wedding of Lieutenant James Morrison and Miss Catherine Walsh on June 5th, Mary's Cathedral in Boston. The photographer was listed as one Harold Pemberton, apparently a well-known society photographer of the era. Among the papers was a manila folder containing additional photographs from the same wedding, candid shots of the reception, family portraits, and various group photos. Eleanor spread them out on her dining table, comparing them to the formal portrait that had been singled out in her great-aunt's letter. It was then that she noticed something peculiar. In all the other photographs, the wedding party looked natural and relaxed, with genuine smiles and casual poses, but in the formal portrait, there was a tension in their expressions, as if they were all concentrating intensely on something beyond the camera. Eleanor picked up her magnifying glass and began a systematic examination of the formal portrait, starting with the bride and groom and working her way outward to the wedding party and background details. The clothing was appropriate for 1950. The hairstyles were period correct, and the church architecture was consistent with Gothic Revival style popular in the early. But as she studied the faces of the wedding party more closely, Eleanor began to notice subtle details that seemed out of place. The expressions weren't quite right for a joyful wedding celebration. Instead of happiness, she saw something that looked almost like concentration, anticipation, fear. Can you spot what's hidden in this 1950 wedding photograph? Look closely at the faces and see if you can identify what caught Eleanor's attention before reading further. Eleanor decided to research the wedding participants to better understand the context of the photograph. The legal documents included a list of names for everyone in the wedding party, and she began searching for information about their lives and backgrounds. Lieutenant James Morrison, she discovered, had been a decorated World War II veteran who served in the Pacific Theater. After the war, he had worked as an engineer for a defense contractor in Boston. Catherine Walsh had been a nurse during the war and had met James at a veterans hospital where she worked after his return from overseas. The more Eleanor learned about the couple, the more intrigued she became. Both James and Catherine had been involved in what appeared to be classified government work in the years following the war. James's engineering firm had contracts with the military, while Catherine had worked at a research facility that was connected to early Cold War defense projects. The wedding party consisted of fellow veterans and their wives, many of whom had also been involved in military or government work during and after the war. It was an impressive group of accomplished individuals, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story than the official records revealed. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself repeatedly drawn back to the formal wedding portrait. There was something about it that demanded attention, a mystery hidden in the carefully composed scene. Her great-aunt's letter had promised that the truth was hidden in plain sight, but Eleanor was beginning to wonder if she would ever be able to see what Vivian had wanted her to find. She decided to take a break from her analysis and called her friend Marcus, a photography expert who specialized in historical images. If anyone could help her understand what made this photograph special, it would be Marcus. "I've got something interesting for you to look at," Eleanor told him over the phone. "Can you come over tonight? I think I'm going to need a second pair of eyes on this one." Marcus arrived that evening with his equipment bag and an eager expression. Eleanor had worked with him on several restoration projects, and she knew that his expertise in photographic analysis was unmatched. "So what's the mystery?" Marcus asked as he set up his magnifying equipment on Eleanor's dining table. Eleanor handed him the photograph and Vivian's letter, watching his face as he read the cryptic message. "My great-aunt claimed this 1950 wedding photo holds some kind of secret, but I can't figure out what she was talking about." Marcus studied the photograph under his magnifying glass, his expression growing more focused as he examined the details. "Interesting," he murmured after several minutes. "The technical quality is excellent for 1950. Professional lighting, careful composition, high-quality paper and processing." He continued in Deus's examination, moving the magnifying glass slowly across the image. "The clothing and hairstyles are period-appropriate. The church architecture looks authentic." "Wait a minute." Eleanor leaned forward eagerly. "What is it?" Marcus was staring intently at a specific section of the photograph. "There's something here that doesn't quite fit. Look at this area behind the wedding party, near the church entrance." Eleanor followed his gaze and saw what appeared to be a shadowy figure partially visible in the background, almost hidden by the architectural details of the church. The figure was so subtle that it was easy to miss unless you knew where to look. "Is that a person?" Eleanor asked, squinting at the barely visible shape. "It looks like it," Marcus replied, adjusting his magnifying glass for better focus. "But here's the strange thing. This person doesn't appear in any of the other wedding photographs you showed me. In the candid shots taken before and after, the formal portrait, this area of the church entrance is clearly empty." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. So someone was standing there only during the formal portrait. "That's what it looks like," Marcus confirmed. "And there's something else. Look at the way the light falls on this figure. It doesn't match the lighting pattern for the rest of the photograph. It's as if this person was illuminated by a different light source entirely." They spent the next hour examining the mysterious figure from every angle, but the image was too indistinct to make out clear details. All they could determine was that it appeared to be a person in dark clothing, standing in a position where they would have been visible to the wedding party, but not the most casual observers of the photograph. Eleanor Marcus said finally, "I think your great-aunt was right. This photograph definitely holds a secret. The question is, who is that person, and why were they hidden in the background of this wedding portrait?" As Marcus packed up his equipment to leave, Eleanor stared at the photograph with new understanding. The tension she had noticed in the wedding party's expressions suddenly made sense. They hadn't been concentrating on the camera. They had been aware of the mysterious figure standing behind them. But who was this person, and what was their connection to the wedding? Eleanor knew that finding the answer would require digging deeper into the lives of James Morrison, Catherine Walsh, and their wedding party. Her great-aunt's secret was beginning to reveal itself, but Eleanor suspected that what she had discovered so far was only the beginning. Eleanor spent the next morning at the Chicago Public Library, diving into newspaper archives and military records from the She was determined to learn everything she could about the Morrison-Walsh wedding and the people involved. The mysterious figure in the photograph had given her a starting point, but she needed more context to understand what she was looking at. Her research revealed that the wedding had been a significant social event in Boston's military community. The Boston Globe had covered it with a full-page spread in their society section, describing it as a celebration of love and service that brought together some of the finest young people of our generation. But as Eleanor read through the newspaper coverage, she noticed something odd. While the article mentioned the formal wedding portrait being taken on the church steps, the photograph that appeared in the newspaper was different from the one she had inherited. The newspaper version showed the same wedding party in the same location, but the mysterious background figure was absent. Eleanor compared the two images side by side, using her magnifying glass to examine every detail. The positioning of the wedding party was identical. Their expressions were the same, and even the lighting appeared to match perfectly. It was as if two photographs had been taken moments apart, with the only difference being the presence or absence of the shadowy figure. This discovery raised new questions. Had the newspaper deliberately chosen to publish a version of the photograph without the mysterious figure, or had someone provided them with an altered image? Eleanor made copies of both photographs and added them to her growing file of evidence. Her next stop was the Boston Public Library's archives, where she hoped to find more information about the photographer, Harold Pemberton. The librarian, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, who specialized in local history, was intrigued by Eleanor's research. Harold Pemberton, emused, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Yes, I remember that name. He was quite well known in Boston society circles during the 1940s and 19 photographed many prominent weddings and social events." Mr. Chen led Eleanor to a section of the archives that contained Pemberton's business records and correspondence. The family donated his professional papers to the library in the 1980s. He explained, "You might find something useful in there." Eleanor spent hours going through Pemberton's files, looking for any reference to the Morrison-Walsh wedding. She found the original contract for the photography services, along with detailed notes about the event. Pemberton had meticulous in his record-keeping, noting everything from the lighting conditions to the specific poses requested by the couple. But it was a handwritten note tucked inside the contract folder that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. June Simatartenciento. Unusual request from bride's family. Asked to take two versions of formal portrait, one standard and one special. Paid extra fee for discretion. Client emphasized importance of keeping special version confidential. Standard version, to be provided to newspapers and family albums. Special version to be sealed and stored separately. Eleanor stared at the note in amazement. So there had indeed been two versions of the formal portrait, and the special version, the one with the mysterious figure, had been deliberately kept secret. But why would the bride's family make such an unusual request? She continued searching through Pemberton's papers and found additional references to the Morrison-Walsh wedding. A letter from Catherine Walsh's mother, dated a week before the wedding, contained specific instructions about the photography. Mr. Pemberton, as we discussed, it is essential that you capture the presence of our special guest in one version of the formal portrait. This person will be positioned behind the wedding party and may not be clearly visible to the naked eye, but your camera should be able to record their image. Please ensure that this version of the photograph is kept separate from all others and is not shared with anyone outside our immediate family. Eleanor felt a chill as she read the letter. The mysterious figure hadn't been an accident or an unwanted intruder. They had been deliberately included in the photograph at the family's request. But who was this special guest, and why had their presence been so important to document? The mystery deepened. Who could this special guest be that the family was so determined to capture in the wedding photograph? What do you think is the significance of having two versions of the same image? Eleanor's research took on new urgency as she realized she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple family photograph. She decided to track down any surviving members of the wedding party who might be able to provide first-hand information about the mysterious figure. Her search led her to discover that most of the wedding party had passed away over the decades, but she found a promising lead. Margaret Morrison, James's younger sister, who had been a bridesmaid in the wedding. According to Eleanor's research, Margaret was still alive and living in a retirement community outside Boston. Eleanor called her retirement home and was connected to Margaret, now 89 years old, but still sharp and articulate. When Eleanor explained her interest in the 1950 wedding photograph, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I wonder when someone would finally ask about that, Margaret said quietly. I've been carrying that secret for over 70 years, waiting for the right person to come along. Eleanor's heart raced. You know about the figure in the photograph? Oh, my dear, Margaret replied. I know much more than that, but this isn't something we can discuss over the phone. If you're serious about understanding what that photograph represents, you'll need to come see me in person. And you'll need to bring the original image with you. Eleanor booked a flight to Boston that same afternoon. As the plane lifted off from Chicago, she clutched the manila envelope containing the mysterious wedding photograph, knowing that she was about to uncover a secret that had been hidden for more than 7 decades. The retirement community where Margaret Morrison lived was a pleasant facility surrounded by gardens and walking paths. Eleanor found Margaret waiting for her in the lobby, a small, elegant woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. You look like your great-aunt, Vivian, Margaret said as they settled into comfortable chairs in a quiet corner of the lobby. She was a remarkable woman, you know, one of the few people who knew the whole truth about what happened that day. Eleanor removed the photograph from its protective sleeve and placed it on the table between them. Margaret studied it for a long moment, her expression mixing nostalgia with something that looked like sadness. I haven't seen this image in over 40 years, Margaret said softly. Catherine made me promise never to speak about it unless someone from Vivian's family came looking for answers. She said that someday, when enough time had passed, the truth would need to be told. What truth? Eleanor asked, leaning forward eagerly. Margaret pointed to the shadowy figure in the background of the photograph. The photograph, that person standing behind us. That's Catherine's brother, Thomas Walsh. He was killed in action in the Pacific Theater in 1944, 6 years before the wedding. Eleanor felt the room spin around her. But that's impossible. If he died in 1944, how could he be in a photograph from me? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That's exactly what we all wonder, my dear. But I was there that day, and I saw him with my own eyes. Thomas Walsh was standing behind us during that formal portrait, as real as you or me, even though we had buried him 6 years earlier. The implications of Margaret's words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She was looking at what appeared to be photographic evidence of a ghost, a spirit who had somehow managed to appear at his sister's wedding and be captured on film. How is that possible? Eleanor whispered, Margaret smiled sadly. That's a story that begins long before the wedding, my dear. And if you truly want to understand what you're looking at, you'll need to hear about the promise that Catherine made to her brother before he shipped out to the Pacific, and the extraordinary lengths she went to in order to keep that promise. Chapter 3. The Promise. Margaret Morrison led Eleanor to her private apartment within the retirement community where the walls were lined with photographs spanning decades of family history. She gestured for Eleanor to sit in a comfortable armchair while she prepared tea, moving with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite her advanced age. Before I tell you about Thomas Walsh, Margaret began, settling into her own chair with a steaming cup, you need to understand the kind of person Catherine was. She wasn't just my brother's bride, she was one of the most determined and resourceful women I've ever known. Margaret reached for a photo album and opened it to a page showing a young woman in a nurse's uniform. This was Catherine during the war. She worked at Boston General Hospital, caring for wounded soldiers who were shipped back from overseas. She saw more suffering and loss in those 4 years than most people see in a lifetime. Eleanor studied the photograph of Catherine Walsh, noting the strength and compassion evident in her young face. How did she meet your brother? James was one of her patients, Margaret replied. He'd been wounded in the Philippines and spent 3 months recovering at Boston General. Catherine was assigned to his care, and they fell in love during his recovery. But their relationship was complicated by the fact that Catherine's brother Thomas was still fighting in the Pacific. Margaret turned to another page in the album, revealing a photograph of a young man in military uniform. Thomas Walsh had the same dark hair and strong features as his sister, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of experiences beyond his years. Thomas and Catherine were incredibly close, Margaret continued. Their parents had died in a car accident when they were teenagers, and they had only each other. When Thomas enlisted in 1942, Catherine made him promise that no matter what happened, he would find a way to be at her wedding. Eleanor felt a chill as she began to understand the significance of Margaret's story. What exactly did she mean by no matter what happened? Margaret's expression grew somber. Catherine had what some people might call a gift, though she considered it more of a burden. She could sense things that others couldn't, spirits, presences, energies that lingered after death. It ran in her family, though she rarely spoke about it. She could see ghosts? Eleanor asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of her voice. She could communicate with those who had passed on, Margaret corrected gently. It wasn't something she advertised, especially during the war, when such beliefs were considered superstitious. But those of us who knew her well had witnessed her abilities firsthand. Margaret stood and walked to a window overlooking the retirement community's gardens. When Thomas shipped out to the Pacific in 1943, Catherine told him about her gift. She made him promise that if anything happened to him, he would find a way to contact her. And more importantly, she made him promise that he would be present at her wedding, even if he couldn't be there in body. Eleanor felt goosebumps rise on her arms. And he agreed to this? Thomas loved his sister more than anything in the world, Margaret replied. If would he have promised her anything? Besides, at that time, they both believed he would make it home safely. The promise seemed like a romantic gesture, not a desperate pact with the afterlife. Margaret returned to her chair and continued her story. Thomas was killed in February 1944. During the Battle of Kwajalein. Catherine received the telegram on a Tuesday morning while she was working at the hospital. I was with her when it arrived. The elderly woman's voice grew thick with emotion as she remembered that day. Catherine didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't collapse like you might expect. She simply folded the telegram, put it in her pocket, and said, "He'll keep his promise." At the time, I thought she was in shock. But she wasn't? Eleanor prompted. No, she was. That very night, Catherine claimed that Thomas visited her in her apartment. She said he appeared to her as clearly as you're sitting here now, and he assured her that he would find a way to honor his promise. From that day forward, Catherine began planning not just for her eventual wedding to James, but for Thomas's presence at that wedding. Margaret opened another section of her photo album, revealing pages of handwritten notes and sketches. Catherine spent months researching spiritual communication, consulting with mediums, and learning about photographic techniques that might capture supernatural phenomena. She was determined to create the conditions that would allow Thomas to appear at her wedding. Eleanor examined the notes, which were written in a careful, precise hand. The pages contained references to seances, spiritual photography, and various techniques for communicating with the dead. It was clear that Catherine had approached her unusual goal with the same methodical determination she had applied to her nursing career. She found Harold Pemberton through her research, Margaret continued. He was one of the few photographers in Boston who had experience with what was then called spirit photography, the practice of attempting to capture images of ghosts and other supernatural phenomena. The supernatural element is revealed. Catherine Walls was trying to capture her deceased brother's spirit in her wedding photograph. Do you believe such things are possible? Or is there another explanation for what appears in the image? Eleanor studied the wedding photograph again, looking at it with new understanding. The tension she had noticed in the wedding party's expressions suddenly made perfect sense. They had all been aware that they were participating in an attempt to photograph a ghost. Did everyone in the wedding party know what Catherine was trying to do? Eleanor asked. Margaret nodded. Catherine was honest with all of us about her intentions. She explained that she believed Thomas would be present at the wedding and that she wanted to capture his image on film. Some people thought she was grief-stricken and delusional, but those of us who knew her well understood that she was completely serious, and you all agreed to participate. How could we refuse? Margaret replied. Catherine had lost her only family member to the war. If there was even a small chance that she could have some kind of connection with Thomas at her wedding, we were willing to help her try. Margaret described the elaborate preparations that Catherine had made for the wedding day. She had worked with Pemberton to plan the exact positioning of the wedding party, the timing of the photograph, and even the specific camera equipment that would be used. Catherine had also conducted what she called spiritual preparations in the days leading up to the wedding, attempting to create a connection with Thomas that would allow him to manifest during the ceremony. The morning of the wedding, Margaret continued, Catherine told me that she had spoken with Thomas the night before. She said he had assured her that he would be there and that we would all be able to see him if we looked carefully. Eleanor felt a mixture of fascination and skepticism as she listened to Margaret's account. The rational part of her mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for what appeared in the photograph, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. What happened during the actual photogramme's scene? Eleanor asked. Margaret's expression grew distant as she recalled that day. We were all positioned on the church steps, waiting for Pemberton to take the formal portrait. Catherine had asked us to concentrate on Thomas, to focus our thoughts on welcoming his presence. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But then, just as Pemberton was preparing to take the photograph, the temperature around us dropped noticeably. It was a warm June day, but suddenly we could see our breath in the air. And then we saw him. You actually saw Thomas Walls? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. As clearly as I'm seeing you now, Margaret confirmed. He was standing behind us, wearing his military uniform, smiling at Catherine with such love and pride. He looked exactly as he had when he left for the Pacific, young and handsome and full of life. Margaret described how the entire wedding party had turned to acknowledge Thomas's presence, which explained the unusual expressions Eleanor had noticed in their faces. They had been looking at a man who had been dead for 6 years, yet who appeared to them as real and solid as any living person. Pemberton took several photographs, Margaret continued, but Thomas was only visible in the formal portrait. In the candid shots taken before and after, he simply wasn't there. He simply wasn't there. It was as if he had appeared specifically for that one moment, to fulfill his promise to Catherine. Eleanor studied the photograph once more, trying to reconcile Margaret's extraordinary account with the evidence before her eyes. The shadowy figure in the background was undeniably present in the image, but was it really the spirit of Thomas Walsh? Or was there another explanation? Margaret, Eleanor said carefully, I have to ask, is it possible that what you all saw was some kind of shared hallucination? Grief and expectation can create powerful psychological effects. Margaret smiled understandingly. I've asked myself that same question for over 70 years, my dear. But there's one piece of evidence that's difficult to explain away through psychology alone. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. After the wedding, Catherine gave me this. She said it was proof that Thomas had really been there, and that someday it might be important for someone to see it. Inside the envelope was a second photograph, a close-up image of the area behind the wedding party where Thomas had appeared. In this image, the figure was much clearer, showing unmistakably the face and uniform of a young soldier who bore a strong resemblance to Catherine Walsh. Eleanor stared at the photograph in amazement. This wasn't a shadowy, indistinct figure that could be dismissed as a photographic artifact. This was a clear, detailed image of a man who, according to all records, had been dead for 6 years when the photograph was taken. How is this possible? Eleanor whispered. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the image of Thomas Walsh. I don't know, my dear, but I do know that love is more powerful than death, and that some promises are strong enough to transcend the boundaries between worlds. Eleanor spent a sleepless night in her Boston hotel room, staring at the two photographs and trying to process everything Margaret had told her. The rational part of her mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for what she was seeing, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss through conventional means. The next morning, she decided to visit the Boston Public Library again to research Harold Pemberton more thoroughly. If he had indeed been experienced in spirit photography, there might be additional records that could shed light on his techniques in other similar cases. Miss Chen was delighted to see Eleanor again and was eager to help with her continued research. I've been thinking about your inquiry into Pemberton's work, he said as he led her back to the archives. After you left yesterday, I remembered that we have some additional materials that might interest you. He guided Eleanor to a section of the archives she hadn't seen before, where older and more fragile documents were stored in climate-controlled cases. Pemberton's family donated more materials in the 1990s, Mr. Chen explained. This included some of his more unusual photographic work. Eleanor's pulse quickened as Mr. Chen opened a file cabinet and withdrew several folders marked Paranormal Photography and Spiritual Phenomena. Inside were dozens of photographs that Pemberton had taken over the course of his career, many of which appeared to show ghostly figures, unexplained lights, and other supernatural manifestations. Pemberton was apparently quite well known in certain circles for his ability to capture images of spirits, Mr. Chen explained. He worked with several prominent mediums and spiritualists during the 1950s, when interest in such phenomena was at its peak. Eleanor studied the photographs with fascination. Many showed what appeared to be translucent figures standing near living subjects, while others captured strange lights or mists that seemed to have no natural explanation. The technical quality of the images was consistently high, suggesting that Pemberton was a skilled photographer, regardless of the unusual nature of his subjects. But it was a handwritten journal that proved most illuminating. Pemberton had kept detailed notes about his paranormal photography work, including specific techniques he had developed for capturing spiritual phenomena on film. One entry, dated May 1950, just 1 month before the Morrison Walsh wedding, caught Eleanor's attention. Successful session with Mrs. Henderson today. Subject's deceased husband appeared clearly in 3 separate exposures. Key factors: emotional connection between subject and spirit, proper lighting conditions, soft, indirect, and most importantly, the use of specialized photographic plates treated with silver bromide solution enhanced with trace amounts of selenium. The selenium appears to increase the sensitivity of the emulsion to what I can only describe as spiritual energy. Standard photographic plates often fail to capture these phenomena, but the enhanced plates have shown remarkable success. Note, must to remember to prepare enhanced plates for the Walsh wedding next month. The bride has specifically requested documentation of her brother's presence, and I am confident that the proper conditions can be achieved. Eleanor felt a surge of excitement as she read Pemberton's notes. It was scientific evidence that the photographer had used specialized techniques specifically designed to capture supernatural phenomena. The mysterious figure in the wedding photograph wasn't just a lucky accident. It was the result of deliberate preparation and technical expertise. She continued reading through Pemberton's journal, finding additional entries that detailed his preparations for the Morrison Walsh wedding. June 10th, she is remarkably well informed about spiritual communication and has provided specific details about her brother's expected manifestation. Miss Walsh reports consistent contact with her brother's spirit over the past 6 years. She describes him as appearing in full military uniform, typically in the early morning hours or during times of emotional significance. She is confident that he will manifest during the wedding ceremony. Have prepared 6 enhanced plates for the formal portrait session. Will use standard plates for all other photographs to avoid questions from family members who may not be aware of the special arrangements. The technical mystery is solved. Harold Pemberton used specially treated photographic plates designed to capture spiritual phenomena. But does this prove that ghosts are real? Or could there be another explanation for these remarkable images? Eleanor spent the rest of the morning reading through Pemberton's extensive notes on spirit photography. She learned that he had developed his techniques over many years of experimentation, working with various mediums and spiritualists to understand the conditions that allowed supernatural phenomena to be captured on film. According to Pemberton's research, successful spiritual photography requires several key elements: a strong emotional connection between the living subjects and the deceased spirit, specific lighting conditions that created what he called spiritual resonance, and most important, photographic plates that had been chemically enhanced to detect energies beyond the normal visible spectrum. The selenium-enhanced plates that Pemberton used were apparently his own invention, developed through years of trial and error. He claimed that the selenium increased the sensitivity of the photographic emulsion to what he described as etheric bidrachic benzones, the energy signatures left behind by departed spirits. Eleanor found herself torn between scientific skepticism and growing fascination with Pemberton's work. His notes were methodical and detailed, written with the precision of a serious researcher rather than the rambling of a deluded amateur. Moreover, his photographic results were consistently impressive, showing clear images of phenomena that conventional photography couldn't capture. She decided to seek out a second opinion and called Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a professor of chemistry at Boston University who specialized in photographic processes. Eleanor explained that she was researching historical photography techniques and was particularly interested in unusual chemical treatments used in the mid-20th century. Dr. Hoffman agreed to meet with Eleanor that afternoon in her laboratory at the university. When Eleanor saw Pemberton's notes about selenium-enhanced photographic plates, the professor's eyebrows rose in surprise. "This is quite sophisticated chemistry for the 1950s, Dr. Hoffman said, studying Pemberton's formula. Selenium was known to have photosensitive properties, but using it to enhance silver bromide emulsions in this way shows a deep understanding of photochemistry. Would these enhanced plates actually be more sensitive to?" Hoffman considered the question thoughtfully. "Well, selenium does extend the spectral sensitivity of photographic emulsions into the infrared range. If there was some kind of an energy emission that wasn't visible to the human eye but fell within the infrared spectrum, these plates might theoretically be able to detect it." Eleanor felt her excitement growing. "So it's scientifically possible that these plates could capture something that normal photography would miss?" "Theoretically, yes," Dr. Hoffman replied. though I should emphasize that we're talking about electromagnetic radiation, not supernatural phenomena. If Pemberton's photographs show unusual images, there would likely be a scientific explanation rather than a paranormal one. Eleanor thanked Dr. Hoffman for her time and returned to her hotel room to consider this new information. The scientific explanation for Pemberton's enhanced photographic plates was intriguing, but it didn't necessarily explain how Thomas Walsh could appear in a photograph 6 years after his death. That evening, Eleanor called Margaret Morrison to share what she had learned about Pemberton's techniques. Margaret listened with interest, but wasn't surprised by the revelation. Catherine always said that Thomas's appearances weren't supernatural in the way most people think of ghosts, Margaret explained. She believed that consciousness could exist independently of the physical body, and that under the right conditions it could interact with the physical world in measurable ways. You mean she thought there was a scientific basis for what she was experiencing? Eleanor asked. Catherine was a nurse. Remember, Margaret replied. She approached everything from a medical and scientific perspective. She didn't believe in magic or superstition, but she did believe that there were natural phenomena that science hadn't yet learned to explain. Margaret went on to describe how Catherine had spent years studying the intersection of consciousness, energy, and physical matter. She had corresponded with researchers who were investigating what would later become known as parapsychology, and she had developed her own theories about how the mind could influence physical reality. Catherine believed that strong emotional connections could create what she called consciousness bridges between the living and the dead, Margaret explained. She thought that Thomas's love for her and his determination to keep his promise had allowed his consciousness to maintain a connection to our world. Eleanor found herself increasingly convinced that she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple hoax or illusion. The combination of Pemberton's technical expertise, Catherine's scientific approach to spiritual phenomena, and the clear photographic evidence suggested that the Morrison-Walsh wedding had been the site of an extraordinary event. But questions remain. If Thomas Walsh had indeed appeared at his sister's wedding, what had happened to him afterward? Had Catherine maintained contact with her brother's spirit throughout her life? And most importantly, why had Eleanor's great-aunt, Vivian, been entrusted with this secret? Eleanor realized that to fully understand the mystery of the 1950 wedding photograph, she would need to learn more about Catherine Walsh's later life and her connection to the Mitchell family. The secret that had been hidden for over 70 years was finally beginning to reveal itself. But Eleanor suspected that the most remarkable revelations were yet to come. Eleanor's investigation took a new direction the following morning, when she decided to research the connection between Catherine Walsh Morrison and her own family. She had been so focused on the supernatural aspects of the wedding photograph that she hadn't fully explored why her great-aunt Vivian had been entrusted with this extraordinary secret. A visit to the Massachusetts State Archives revealed that Vivian Mitchell had worked as a nurse at Boston General Hospital during the same period as Catherine Walsh. According to employment records, the two women had been colleagues and close friends throughout the 90s. Eleanor found additional evidence of their friendship in Vivian's personal papers, which had been donated to the archives, along with the wedding photograph. Among the documents was a collection of letters between Vivian and Catherine that spanned several decades, providing insight into their relationship and Catherine's ongoing experiences with her deceased brother. The earliest letter, dated 1945, revealed that Vivian had been one of the few people Catherine had confided in about her ability to communicate with Thomas. "Dearest Vivian, I hope you won't think me mad when I tell you what happened last. Thomas came to me again, as real as life, standing at the foot of my bed in his dress uniform. He spoke to me about James, saying that he approves of our engagement and that he's happy I found love again. You know how this must sound, but I swear to you that these visits are not dreams or hallucinations. Thomas is as present and real as he was when he was alive. The only difference is that others cannot see him as I do. You are the only person I can share this with, Vivian. Please don't think less of me for these strange experiences. Your devoted friend, Catherine." Vivian's response, found in the same collection, showed that she had been supportive and understanding of Catherine's unusual experiences. "My dear Catherine, he could never think less of you for anything, least of all for maintaining a connection with your beloved brother. Having worked with so many wounded soldiers, I have seen too much to dismiss the possibility that consciousness might survive bodily death. If Thomas is truly visiting you, then I believe it is because your love for each other transcends the boundaries that separate the living from the dead. You should consider this a gift, not a burden. He will always be here to listen and support you, no matter how extraordinary your experiences may seem. With love and understanding, Vivian." Eleanor continued reading through the correspondence, which documented Catherine's ongoing relationship with her brother's spirit. Throughout the letters revealed that Thomas's appearances became more frequent as Catherine's wedding approached, and that he had provided specific guidance about how to ensure his presence would be captured in the wedding photograph. One letter, written just weeks before the wedding, contained detailed instructions that Thomas had apparently given Catherine about the photographic session. "Vivian, Thomas has been very specific about the arrangements for the wedding photograph. He says that I must work with a photographer who understands spiritual resonance and who can prepare the proper equipment to capture his image. He has also told me that the photograph will serve as more than just a memento of his presence at my wedding. He says it will be proof for future generations that love and consciousness can transcend death, and that this proof will be needed when the world is ready to understand such things. Thomas insists that the photograph must be preserved and protected, and that it should only be revealed when someone with the proper understanding comes looking for it. He has asked me to entrust this responsibility to you, dear Vivian, as you are the only person who truly understands what we are dealing with." Eleanor felt a chill as she read this letter. Thomas Walsh had apparently foreseen that his wedding photograph would eventually be discovered by someone seeking to understand its significance. Someone like Eleanor herself. The correspondence continued through the 1950s and 1960s, documenting Catherine's life as a married woman and her ongoing communication with Thomas. The letters revealed that Catherine had become something of an informal counselor for other people who had lost loved ones in the war, helping them to understand and cope with their own supernatural experiences. Eleanor realized she was part of a larger story that had been unfolding for decades. But it was a letter from the 1970s that provided the most shocking revelation about Catherine's later life. "Dearest Vivian, I must share with you the most extraordinary development in my ongoing connection with Thomas. He has told me that he is not the only spirit who has maintained a presence in our world, and that there are others like him who have found ways to bridge the gap between life and death. Thomas says that he has been working with these other spirits to help people who are struggling with grief and loss. He calls it spiritual service, and he believes it is his purpose for remaining connected to our world. More importantly, Thomas has told me that our family's ability to communicate with the dead is not unique to us. He says that this gift runs in certain bloodlines and that it will manifest in future generations when the time is right. He has specifically mentioned your family, Vivian. He says that one of your descendants will inherit this ability and will play an important role in helping the world understand the true nature of consciousness and death." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read these words. According to Catherine's letter, Thomas Walsh had predicted that someone from Vivian's family line would inherit the ability to communicate with spirits. Was it possible that Eleanor herself was the descendant Thomas had foreseen? She continued reading and found a letter from Vivian's response, which showed that she had taken Thomas's prediction seriously. "Catherine, if Thomas is correct about my family's potential for spiritual communication, then I must prepare for this possibility. He had decided to preserve the wedding photograph and all related documents, along with detailed instructions about their significance. If one of my descendants does inherit this gift, they will need to understand the history behind it and the responsibility that comes with such abilities. The photograph will serve as proof that communication between the living and the dead is possible, and it will help them understand their own experiences. I pray that when the time comes, my descendant will be wise enough to use this knowledge for good and to help others who are struggling with loss and grief." Eleanor sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she had discovered. The wedding photograph wasn't just evidence of a single supernatural event. It was part of a larger legacy that had been carefully preserved for future generations. She thought about her own life and the strange experiences she had occasionally dismissed as imagination or coincidence. There had been times when she felt the presence of deceased relatives, moments when she seemed to know things she couldn't possibly know, and dreams that felt more real than waking life. Could it be that she had inherited the same gift that allowed Catherine Walsh to communicate with her dead brother? And if so, what was she supposed to do with this knowledge? Eleanor decided to call Margaret Morson to share her discoveries and to ask about Catherine's later life. Margaret was fascinated to learn about the correspondence between Catherine and Vivian, and she confirmed that Catherine had become known for her ability to help people cope with supernatural experiences. Catherine never advertised her gift, Margaret explained, but word spread through the community of war widows and grieving families. People would come to her for comfort and guidance, and she was always able to help them find peace. Did she continue to see Thomas throughout her life? Eleanor asked. Oh yes, Margaret replied. Right up until her death in Mill. She used to say that Thomas was her guardian angel, watching over her and guiding her in her work with other grieving families. Margaret paused, then added, Catherine always said that the wedding photograph was just the beginning of something much larger. She believed that as more people became open to the possibility of life after death, there would be others who would inherit the ability to bridge the gap between worlds. Eleanor felt a sense of destiny settling over her, as she realized that she might be one of those people Catherine had foreseen. The wedding photograph had found its way to her for a reason, and she was beginning to understand that her role in this story was far from over. Eleanor returned to Chicago with a profound sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of her family's extraordinary legacy. The wedding photograph that had seemed like a simple inheritance had revealed itself to be evidence of something far more significant, a documented case of communication between the living and the dead, preserved for future generations who would be ready to understand its implications. Over the 4 weeks, Eleanor found herself experiencing phenomena that she could no longer dismiss as coincidence or imagination. She began to sense presences in her apartment, particularly in the early morning hours when the veil between worlds seemed thinnest. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of figures in her peripheral vision, and occasionally she would hear voices speaking her name when no one else was present. Rather than being frightened by these experiences, Eleanor felt a growing sense of connection to something larger than herself. She began to understand that the gift Catherine Walsh had possessed and that Thomas Walsh had predicted would manifest in Vivian's descendants was awakening within her. Eleanor decided to research other cases of documented spirit photography and supernatural phenomena, hoping to better understand her emerging abilities. She discovered that Harold Pemberton had not been unique in his work with paranormal photography, and that there was a rich history of attempts to document life after death through scientific means. Her research led her to Dr. Sarah Chen, a parapsychologist at Northwestern University, who specialized in studying mediumship and after-death communication. When Eleanor contacted Dr. Chen and shared her story, the professor was immediately intrigued. What you're describing is consistent with what we call inherited mediumship, Dr. Chen explained during their first meeting. There are documented cases of psychic abilities running in family lines, often skipping generations before manifesting in individuals who are emotionally and intellectually prepared to handle them. Dr. Chen examined the wedding photograph and the supporting documents with great interest. This is remarkable evidence, she said. The combination of eyewitness testimony, photographic documentation, and detailed historical records makes this one of the most compelling cases of spirit manifestation I've ever encountered. Eleanor asked Dr. Chen about the scientific basis for such phenomena, and the professor explained that modern quantum physics was beginning to provide theoretical frameworks for understanding consciousness as something that might exist independently of the physical brain. We're discovering that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe, like energy or matter, Dr. Chen explained. If that's true, then it's possible that consciousness could survive bodily death and even interact with the physical world under certain conditions. Eleanor Realia de Salao is standing at the threshold of a new understanding of life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. Encouraged by Dr. Chen Sopor, Eleanor began to develop her mediumistic abilities through meditation, study, and careful practice. She found that she could indeed sense the presence of spirits, and gradually she began to receive clear communications from those who had passed on. Her first significant contact came one evening in November. As she was sitting in her apartment studying the wedding photograph, she suddenly became aware of a presence in the room, and when she looked up, she saw a young man in military uniform standing near her bookshelf. "You must be Eleanor," the figure said, his voice clear and warm. "I'm Thomas Walsh. I've been waiting a long time to speak with you." Eleanor's heart raced, but she felt no fear. Thomas appeared exactly as he did in the wedding photograph, young, handsome, and radiating a sense of peace and purpose. "I know this must be overwhelming," Thomas continued, "but I want you to understand that you've inherited a great gift." Catherine and Vivian preserved our story because they knew that someday someone like you would need to understand what's possible. Over the following months, Eleanor maintained regular communication with Thomas Walsh, who became her guide and teacher in understanding her mediumistic abilities. He explained that consciousness truly did survive death, and that those who passed on could choose to maintain connections with the living world in order to provide comfort, guidance, and proof that love transcends physical existence. The wedding photograph was just the beginning, Thomas told her during one of their conversations. "Catherine and I wanted to leave evidence that could be verified and studied, so that when the world was ready to accept the reality of life after death, there would be proof that couldn't be dismissed." Thomas revealed that there were many spirits like him who had chosen to remain connected to the physical world in order to help the living. He described a vast network of consciousness that existed beyond physical death, working to guide humanity toward a greater understanding of the true nature of existence. Eleanor began to use her abilities to help others who were struggling with grief and loss, just as Catherine Walsh had done decades earlier. She found that she could often facilitate communication between the living and their deceased loved ones, providing comfort and closure to those who needed it most. Word of Eleanor's gift spread gradually through the community, and she began to receive requests for help from people who had heard about her abilities. She was careful to approach each case with sensitivity and scientific rigor, always seeking to verify the information she received and to provide genuine comfort rather than false hope. Chen became a valuable collaborator in Eleanor's work, helping to document and study the communication she facilitated. Together they began to build a body of scientific evidence supporting the reality of consciousness survival and after-death communication. The wedding photograph that had started Eleanor's journey became the centerpiece of their research, serving as documented proof that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than most people believe. They presented their findings at academic conferences and published papers in peer-reviewed journals, gradually building acceptance for the idea that consciousness might indeed survive bodily death. Eleanor also established the Thomas Walsh Foundation, dedicated to researching consciousness survival and providing support for people who were experiencing supernatural phenomena. The foundation's work helped to legitimize the study of life after death and to provide resources for others who were developing mediumistic abilities. As Eleanor reflected on her journey from art restoration specialist to medium and researcher, she marveled at the chain of events that had led her to discover her true calling. The wedding photograph, that had seemed like a simple family heirloom, had revealed itself to be a key that unlocked an entirely new understanding of reality. Thomas Walsh's promise to his sister had indeed been kept, but in ways that went far beyond his appearance at her wedding. Through the preservation of their story and the awakening of Eleanor's abilities, Thomas and Catherine had helped to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, providing proof that love and consciousness truly do transcend physical existence. The secret that had been hidden in the 1950 wedding photograph for over 70 years was finally revealed. But Eleanor understood that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The photograph had served its purpose as evidence and inspiration, but the real work of helping humanity understand the true nature of consciousness and death was just getting started. Eleanor often looked at the wedding photograph and smiled, knowing that Thomas Walsh was still present, still working to help others understand that death was not an ending, but a transformation. The bride and groom in the photograph had been surrounded by love on their wedding day, including the love of someone who had transcended death itself to be present for their celebration. The secret that Catherine Walsh had carried for decades, that consciousness survives death and that love can bridge any gap, was no longer hid. Through Eleanor's work and the evidence preserved in that remarkable wedding photograph, the world was beginning to understand that the boundary between life and death was not as solid as it appeared, and that those we love never truly leave us. The 1950 wedding picture had indeed held a secret that no one would ever forget. Proof that love is stronger than death, and that consciousness is the one thing that truly cannot be destroyed. Thomas Walsh had kept his promise to his sister, and in doing so, he had given humanity a gift that would continue to provide comfort and hope for generations to come.